Hope you're doing well. I've been talking to different media about some of the legacy of Dick Cheney, who served in so many capacities. So I thought I'd just spend a few minutes and share some of them with my community on the long view, my favorite of all. And just briefly, I think there's four things I think about looking at Dick Cheney's career in its entirety. The first, and it's the most important, I've written about this and I've been speaking about this, is the marriage between conservatism, modern conservatism, and executive power. I think he was really a pivotal figure in that relationship. This has been one of the most consistent themes it was of his career. He was focused on this when he was chief of staff to President Ford, and that was in mid 1970s when Congress was acting in a more assertive way in response to Vietnam and Watergate. And Cheney really encouraged President Ford to push back. And this was something he continued to argue that executive power should be grandiose. In Congress, he was the one of the co-authors of the Minority Report for the Iran-Contra Committee, which I urge all of you to read. It's basically a blueprint for executive power, again, at a very grand level. And this is something as vice president under President George W. Bush that was pivotal to the way that the war on terror after 9/11 was constructed. So the first is this marriage between conservatism and executive power. A second issue, I think, or legacy, which is really important, and it's what some historians have looked at. It's a generation of conservatives who worked within government rather than outside it. A lot of people are interested, rightly so, in grassroots activism after the 1970s and conservatives who mobilized from below. But there was a whole group of conservatives who kind of set out to fight government from within government. I urge you, if you want to read a terrific book on this, Meg Jacobs' Panic at the Pump is terrific. My spouse, and she covers that in the 1970s, including Cheney, and it remains a key theme right through today. It's a lot of work on the OMB, and how kind of a lot of the cuts are taking place within the processes of government through that office. So I think Cheney embodies this more than anyone, given the number of roles that he served. He was a public servant, but he used his positions very much to advance the conservative agenda. Third legacy, obviously, is the vice presidency. He is not the person who creates the modern vice presidency. I think the historical work is pretty clear that certainly since Walter Mondale, who was President Carter's vice president, you see the office become more and more important, including as a policymaking institution, not simply as a liaison with Congress, which is obviously important. But that said, in terms of scale and scope, Dick Cheney as vice president in the early 2000s demonstrates in a way that none of his predecessors had, not even President H.W. Bush, how much could be done with that office when it was deployed strategically and when it was used aggressively. And finally, I think even at a moment of memorializing Dick Cheney as the funeral is taking place, it's important to note he was extraordinarily controversial. And the way in which the war on terror was constructed as one area where many human rights were kind of violated, and torture was deployed as part of that policy. And secondly, the war in Iraq, both of which became hugely not just controversial, but also led to the extreme unpopularity of President Bush by the end of his term. And some argue really uh, kind of created rifts in the Republican Party that led the way to President Trump remaking it. So I think that's also part, and as Lee is saying, there's also a legacy on domestic policy. And this fits with what I'm talking about with conservatism, where he was very much at the forefront of deregulation, including on climate change and environmentalism, and opening up fossil fuel exploration, as he does in the first year of the Bush presidency, heading a task force on energy. So I just want to send those out. A few thoughts of how I think of his legacy. There's much more, but those are some of the key points. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.